You don't get to stand at that podium and pretend you knew him better than his own son did. Daniel Whitmore, Whitmore Industries, Board Meeting. Chapter 1. The Empty Chair at the Memorial. The dining room at Ashford House smelled like lilies and candle wax, and Daniel Whitmore hated both. He stood near the doorway with his 6-year-old daughter's hand wrapped tight in his, watching 40-some relatives arrange themselves around a table set for a dead man's memorial like it was a corporate gala. Crystal glasses caught the chandelier light. A framed photograph of his grandfather Arthur Whitmore sat propped at the head of the table where the old man used to sit and carve the turkey every Thanksgiving of Daniel's childhood. Lily tugged his sleeve. "Daddy, why is everyone looking at us?" "They're not," he lied, crouching to fix the collar of her navy dress. "Let's find our seats." There were no seats reserved for them. He should have expected that. His Aunt Patricia spotted him first, her mouth curling into the particular smile she reserved for people she considered beneath acknowledgement. "Daniel, I didn't think you'd have the nerve to show up." "He was my grandfather, too," Daniel said evenly. "He was a lot of people's grandfather. Some of them actually visited him." Patricia's eyes dropped to Lily, then back up as if the child were an accessory Daniel had chosen poorly. "Where's the nanny tonight? Or did you finally have to let her go?" A ripple of laughter moved through the small cluster of cousins near the bar cart. Daniel felt his jaw tighten, felt the old familiar heat climb his neck, and did what he always did. He said nothing. He had learned the night Sarah drove home from the last Whitmore dinner she would ever attend 2 years ago and never arrived, that silence cost him less than defending himself ever did. His Uncle Marcus arrived a moment later, immaculate in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Daniel's truck payment, moving through the room with the easy authority of a man who had been running Whitmore Industries on an interim basis for exactly 11 days and already believed the chair was his by inheritance rather than circumstance. "Daniel." Marcus extended a hand that felt more like a formality than a greeting. "Surprised to see you. I assumed you'd be working, some job site somewhere." "I took the week off for my grandfather's memorial." "Of course." Marcus's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Very touching, though I do wonder what you're hoping to get out of tonight." The words landed exactly where they were meant to. Daniel felt Lily's small hand tighten around his fingers. Felt her look up at him with the particular stillness children develop when they sense adults being cruel, but don't yet have language for it. "I'm here to say goodbye to a man I loved," Daniel said. "That's all." "How noble." Marcus turned before Daniel could answer, already moving toward a knot of board members near the window, men in dark suits who nodded at him like he was already chairman. That was when Daniel saw her. Claire Hale stood near the head of the table, a leather portfolio tucked against her side, dressed in the kind of tailored navy suit that announced she was here in a professional capacity and not merely as a mourner. He recognized her vaguely, a distant cousin by adoption, the daughter of a Whitmore in-law who'd been folded into the family 2 decades ago and had spent her whole childhood, as far as Daniel could remember, trying to prove she belonged. She'd become a lawyer. He'd heard she'd been retained by the estate to help manage the transition of company assets. Their eyes met for half a second. Something flickered across her face, recognition maybe, or discomfort, and then she looked away toward Marcus, toward the safety of people who mattered. Daniel understood. He didn't blame her. He'd learned a long time ago that survival in this family meant choosing sides quickly and never looking back. "Daddy," Lily whispered, "can we go home?" "Soon, baby. We just have to sit through dinner first." He found 2 empty chairs at the far end of the table near the kitchen doors, the seats nobody else wanted because the servers kept swinging through with trays. It was, he thought, exactly where the family had decided he belonged. Close enough to be present, far enough to be irrelevant. Dinner unfolded in the particular rhythm of Whitmore family gatherings, toasts to Arthur's legacy, stories about the company he'd built from a single steel foundry into a multinational conglomerate, careful mentions of how the board would proceed, In this difficult transitional period, delivered mostly by Marcus, who kept glancing toward the empty chair at the head of the table as if measuring it for his own frame. Nobody mentioned Daniel's name. Nobody asked about Lily, about school, about the life he'd built in the 2 years since Sarah's accident had taken the one person in this family who'd ever looked at him without an agenda. It was Patricia, 3 glasses of wine into the evening, who finally said what everyone else had been implying all night. "I think it's remarkable," she announced, loud enough to carry, "that some people can show up to a memorial and act as though they didn't spend the last decade disappointing the man in that photograph." The table went quiet. Daniel felt every eye shift toward him. "Patricia," someone murmured, a half-hearted attempt at restraint. "No, I'll say it." She turned fully toward Daniel, wineglass in hand. "Arthur gave you every opportunity, a position at the company, an education, and you threw it all away to marry a woman with nothing, and now look at you. Raising a child alone in some rental apartment, working construction like a... That's enough." The voice cut through before Daniel could speak, and he was startled to realize it belonged to Claire. She'd stepped forward from where she'd been standing near the window, her expression tight with something that looked almost like her own surprise at speaking up. "This is a memorial, not the place for this." Patricia's eyebrows lifted. "And who asked you, dear? You've been part of this family for what, 20 years? Some of us remember when you were just the girl nobody knew what to do with." Claire's face went pale, and Daniel watched the old wound open behind her eyes. Recognized it, in fact, because it mirrored something in himself. He watched her decide in real time whether to keep fighting or retreat. She retreated. She stepped back half a step, murmured something about it not being her place, and the moment passed, swallowed by the clink of glasses and Marcus smoothly redirecting the conversation back to legacy and leadership and the bright future of Whitmore Industries under new stewardship. Daniel stood. "Lily, come on, we're leaving." "Daniel," Marcus's voice silk over steel, "running off so soon? I thought you came to honor your grandfather." "I did." Daniel lifted Lily into his arms, feeling her small body curl automatically against his shoulder, seeking safety the way she always did when the adults around her turned sharp. "I've said my goodbye. I don't need to stay and be your entertainment for the rest of the night." He was almost to the door when Marcus called out, casual as a man discussing weather. "You know there's a reading of the will tomorrow. Downtown Grayson and Associates, 10 o'clock. You're welcome to attend, though I can't imagine there's much reason to." Daniel didn't turn around. "I'll think about it." "Do," Marcus said. "It might finally give you some closure. Help you understand where you actually stand in this family." The words followed Daniel out into the cold October night, into the gravel driveway where his 10-year-old truck sat parked at the very edge of the lot, as far from the sleek, imported cars as physically possible. He buckled Lily into her booster seat, and she looked up at him with the frank, unfiltered assessment only children seem capable of. "Daddy, why do they hate us?" Daniel's throat tightened. He thought of 100 answers: because your grandma wasn't rich, because I chose love over the family business, because grief makes people cruel, and cruelty needs a target. But what he said was simpler. "They don't know us, sweetheart, that's all. People say ugly things about what they don't understand. Grandpa Arthur didn't hate us." Daniel paused, one hand on the car door. "No, he didn't." It was true, though Daniel had spent the last several years unsure exactly what to do with that truth. Arthur Whitmore had been distant in his final years, rarely visiting, rarely calling. But every few months, a small, unmarked envelope would arrive at Daniel's apartment. No return address. Inside, always the same thing. A savings bond in Lily's name, sometimes a photograph of Daniel's late father as a boy. Once, a single line on a note card that read simply, "I see you. Keep going." Daniel had kept every one of those envelopes in an old cigar box on his closet shelf alongside a leather notebook his grandfather had pressed into his hands the last time they'd spoken face-to-face, 8 months before Arthur's stroke. "Don't open it unless you need it." Arthur had said, his grip surprisingly strong on Daniel's wrist. "You'll know when." Daniel had never opened it. He wasn't sure he knew what needing it was supposed to feel like. And some part of him, the part that had learned not to hope for too much from this family, suspected that whatever was inside would only be another disappointment wrapped in expensive stationery. He drove home through streets slick with the season's first hard rain. Lily asleep before they'd even left the estate's long driveway, and did not notice until he was almost to his apartment that his phone had buzzed twice with a call from a number he didn't recognize. He didn't check it that night. He carried Lily up 2 flights of stairs, tucked her into bed, and sat for a long time at his kitchen table with a lukewarm cup of coffee, staring at the cigar box he'd pulled down from the closet without quite deciding to. He didn't open the notebook, not yet, but he set it on the table in front of him. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he let himself wonder what his grandfather had actually seen when he looked at him, because it clearly wasn't the same disappointment the rest of the family saw. The unknown number called again at 11 the next morning, while Daniel was on a job site, forearms deep in drywall dust. And this time, he answered. "Mr. Whitmore," a brisk, unfamiliar voice. "This is Diane from Grayson & Associates. We've been trying to reach you regarding the estate of Arthur Whitmore. There's a matter requiring your presence at the formal reading of the will." "I was told about that. Tomorrow, 10 o'clock. Attically, Mr. Whitmore." A pause, papers shuffling somewhere on the other end of the line. "Mr. Grayson has asked that you come in specifically today before the formal reading. He said it was important you understood something before you walked into that room with the rest of the family." Daniel stood very still, drywall dust settling on his shoulders like ash. "Understood what?" "He'd prefer to explain in person, sir. Can you come by this afternoon?" Daniel looked down at his dust-covered hands, thought of Patricia's wine-loosened cruelty, thought of Marcus's careful invitation delivered like a trap disguised as generosity, and thought finally of the leather notebook still sitting untouched on his kitchen table. "You'll know when." "I'll be there," he said. Grayson & Associates occupied the 11th floor of a glass tower downtown, the kind of office that smelled like old leather and older money. Daniel arrived still in his work clothes, having not had time to change, and felt every head in the waiting room turn toward the paint flecks on his jeans. He didn't care. 2 years of being underestimated had worn that particular insecurity smooth. Harold Grayson met him at the door personally. A tall, silver-haired man in his 60s with the calm, unreadable face of someone who had spent 4 decades keeping other people's secrets. "Mr. Whitmore, thank you for coming on short notice. Your assistant made it sound urgent." "It is." Grayson gestured him into a private office, closed the door, and did not sit down immediately, which Daniel understood somehow as a kind of respect. The old man wasn't going to make him feel like a supplicant in a chair, while Grayson loomed behind a desk. "I need to ask you something first, and I need an honest answer. Did your grandfather ever give you anything before he passed? A document, a notebook, anything? He asked you to keep private?" Daniel's chest tightened. "Why are you asking me that?" "Because Arthur came to me 8 months ago and rewrote his will entirely in complete secrecy and told me that whatever he'd given you would matter more tomorrow than anyone in that family currently understands." Grayson finally sat, folding his hands on the desk. "He was very specific, Mr. Whitmore. He said, and I'm quoting directly, 'Daniel will have the notebook. Make sure the room understands what it means before anyone tries to explain it away.'" Daniel felt the floor tilt slightly beneath him. "He gave me a leather notebook 2 years ago. Told me not to open it unless I needed to. I'd suggest," Grayson said quietly, "that tomorrow morning you might finally need to." Daniel drove home that evening with his hands tight on the wheel, Grayson's words circling in his skull. And when Lily was finally asleep, he sat once more at the kitchen table with the cigar box open in front of him and the notebook resting on top like something waiting to detonate. He still didn't open it. But for the first time, his fingers rested on the cover for nearly a full minute before he set it back down. And somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the old, practiced numbness he used to survive family dinners, like the one the night before, something unfamiliar stirred. Hope, maybe. Or its more dangerous cousin, the fear of hope, disappointed. He closed the box, set his alarm for the reading of the will, and lay awake long after the apartment had gone dark, listening to Lily's soft breathing through the thin wall between their rooms, wondering what exactly his grandfather had seen in him that the rest of the family had spent 6 years refusing to. Chapter 2. The phone call no one was supposed to hear. The morning of the will reading arrived gray and cold, the kind of Chicago autumn day that made the glass towers downtown look like they were dissolving into the sky. Daniel dropped Lily at school early, a small mercy, he thought, that she wouldn't have to sit through whatever indignity the family had planned for this particular chapter, and arrived at Grayson and Associates 15 minutes before 10, wearing the only suit he owned, the one he'd bought for Sarah's funeral, and never had occasion to wear since. The conference room already held most of the family by the time he walked in. Marcus sat at the head of the long table, already occupying the position with the easy confidence of a man rehearsing for a role he assumed was his. Patricia sat 2 seats down, still nursing what looked like the tail end of last night's hangover behind oversized sunglasses she hadn't bothered to remove. Several cousins Daniel barely recognized filled the remaining chairs, along with 3 board members he did recognize from the memorial dinner. Claire sat near the far end, her leather portfolio open in front of her, papers arranged with the meticulous precision of someone who used organization as armor. She glanced up when Daniel entered, and this time she didn't look away as quickly. "Daniel." Marcus's voice carried across the room, pleasant and poisonous in equal measure. "Glad you decided to join us. Though I should warn you, this shouldn't take long." "I appreciate the warning," Daniel said, and took the one remaining seat near the door, exactly as far from the center of family power as he'd been seated at dinner the night before. Grayson entered a few minutes later, carrying a leather folio, and the room settled into the particular silence that precedes the reading of a will. A silence made of greed, dressed as grief, Daniel thought, though he supposed his own presence complicated that judgment. He wasn't entirely sure why he'd come. Some part of him had expected. Nothing had braced for the ritual humiliation of watching Marcus and Patricia divide the empire while he sat in the corner as a footnote to a family history that had already written him out. "Before I begin," Grayson said, settling at the head of the table opposite Marcus, "I want to remind everyone that Arthur Whitmore's final will was drafted and notarized 8 months before his death, superseding any prior documents. It reflects his wishes as clearly and legally as any document I've ever prepared in 40 years of practice." Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. 8 months. That's rather sudden for a man of his age to be revising his estate. "He was of sound mind and clear intention," Grayson said without elaborating further, and opened the folio. The initial provisions were unremarkable. Smaller bequests to household staff, a donation to the hospital wing that bore the Whitmore name, modest trusts for several of the younger cousins. Daniel listened with half his attention, watching Marcus's posture grow more relaxed with each item that failed to threaten his assumed position, watching Patricia check her phone beneath the table, as though the whole proceeding bored her. Then Grayson paused, and something in the quality of his silence made the room go still. "The remaining provisions of the estate," he said, "including full controlling interest in Whitmore Industries, are addressed in a separate document. Given the significance and complexity of that provision, Arthur requested to be read at a follow-up meeting once certain conditions have been verified. I'll be in touch with the relevant parties within the week." The room erupted into a low murmur of confusion. Marcus leaned forward. "What conditions? What separate document? Harold, I've been running this company for 11 days on an interim basis. I need clarity on succession. The board needs." "The board will have clarity," Grayson said calmly, Once the conditions are verified, I'm not able to say more today. Patricia's sunglasses came off. This is absurd. Arthur is dead. Just read the will. I am reading the will as instructed, Mrs. Ashcroft. Arthur was extremely specific about the sequence of these disclosures, and I intend to honor his wishes to the letter. Grayson closed the folio. That concludes what I'm authorized to share today. Daniel sat very still through the confused scraping of chairs, the outraged murmuring, Marcus's low, urgent conversation with one of the board members near the window. Nobody looked at him. Nobody had reason to, as far as this room was concerned. He'd inherited nothing, mentioned nowhere, exactly as expected. But Grayson caught his eye across the room just for a moment, and something in the old lawyer's expression made Daniel's pulse quicken. He was almost to the elevator when Claire caught up with him in the hallway. "Daniel," she said his name carefully, like she wasn't sure she had the right to. "Can I talk to you for a second?" He turned, surprised. "About what?" "About last night." She glanced back toward the conference room, lowering her voice. "I should have said more. Patricia had no right to talk to you that way, and I let it go because I was worried about how it would look for me to push back too hard. You don't owe me an apology." "I think I do." Her hands tightened around her portfolio. "I've spent my whole life in this family trying to prove I belong, and somewhere along the way I think I forgot how much that costs other people. I watched you get humiliated last night, and I thought about my own seat at that table more than I thought about you." Daniel studied her for a long moment. There was something disarming about the admission, and honesty he hadn't expected from anyone connected to this family, especially not from a lawyer whose entire profession of life depended on the Whitmore's goodwill. "I appreciate you saying that," he said finally, "but I've learned not to expect much from anyone wearing this family's name. No offense." "None taken. I'm not sure I'd trust me either," she hesitated, then added, "Can I ask you something? Do you have any idea what that separate document might be? The one Grayson mentioned?" "No." Daniel lied, thinking of the notebook sitting in his cigar box of Grayson's private warning the day before. "Why would I?" Something flickered across Claire's face, not quite suspicion, but close to it before she smoothed it away. "No reason. It's just strange." Arthur was very deliberate about everything. If he structured the reading this way, there's a reason. And I don't think it's a reason Marcus is going to like. They parted at the elevator, and Daniel spent the ride down, turning her words over in his mind, wondering how much she knew, how much she suspected, and whether her sudden warmth toward him was genuine or simply the careful positioning of someone hedging her bets in a family where power was about to shift in ways nobody yet understood. He didn't have long to wonder before his own life delivered its next complication. He was in the parking garage, keys in hand, when he heard Marcus's voice carry from around the concrete pillar nearest the elevator bank. Sharp, low, urgent in a way Daniel had never heard from his uncle before. Daniel froze instinctively, some old habit of self-preservation keeping him still and silent. "I don't care what Grayson thinks he's protecting. You need to get into those accounts before anyone starts asking real questions." Marcus was saying, his voice tight with something that sounded almost like fear beneath the practiced control. "The auditors aren't supposed to look at anything before Q1 that gives us time to..." A pause. Someone on the other end of the call must have interrupted him. No, absolutely not. If Daniel gets anywhere near that company, the first thing that happens is a full financial review, and you know exactly what that review is going to find. Another pause, longer this time. "I don't care how you do it. Make sure his name never gets past this next meeting. Whatever it takes." Daniel's blood ran cold. He stood frozen behind the pillar, heart hammering as Marcus's footsteps clicked away across the concrete. Phone still pressed to his ear, voice fading into the echoing garage. He didn't understand everything he'd just heard, but he understood enough to know that his uncle was afraid of an audit, afraid of what getting anywhere near that company might reveal, afraid enough to say whatever it takes about ensuring Daniel's name disappeared from whatever process Grayson had just set in motion. He thought of the notebook again, of Arthur's insistence on sequencing the will exactly this way, of Grayson's private warning the day before tomorrow you might finally need it. Something was happening beneath the surface of this family that went far beyond old grudges about who'd married beneath their station. Daniel drove to pick up Lily from school in a fog, going through the motions of normal fatherhood, buckling her seatbelt, asking about her day, listening to her chatter about a butterfly the class had watched emerge from its chrysalis, while his mind turned over what he'd overheard, fitting it against 6 years of careful cruelty and calculated distance, wondering for the first time whether any of it had ever really been about him at all. That night, after Lily was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with a cigar box open in front of him, the leather notebook resting in his palms. He still didn't open it. But he thought about his grandfather's hands on his wrist, the strange intensity in the old man's eyes during their last real conversation. And for the first time, the fear of disappointment felt smaller than the fear of not knowing. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. No name attached. This is Diane from Grayson's office. Mr. Grayson asked me to reach out directly. He said to tell you, bring the notebook to the next meeting. He said you'd understand. Daniel stared at the message for a long time before setting the phone down, his hand trembling slightly as he finally carefully opened the cover of the notebook his grandfather had given him 2 years before. The first page held a single line written in Arthur Whitmore's careful, old-fashioned handwriting. If you're reading this, someone finally forced your hand. Good. It's about time this family learned what you're actually made of. Daniel closed the notebook again, his heart pounding, and did not sleep that night. Chapter 3. What the Notebook Doesn't Say. Daniel didn't finish reading the notebook that first night. He told himself it was because Lily woke up at 2 a.m. with a bad dream and needed him, and that was true. But it was also true that some part of him needed the interruption, needed the excuse to close the cover and step back from whatever his grandfather had left him. Because the first page alone had cracked something open he wasn't sure he was ready to feel. He read another few pages over the following 2 days in stolen minutes between job sites and school pickups, and what he found unsettled him in ways he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't a legal document. It wasn't even strictly about inheritance. It was something closer to a confession. Page after page of his grandfather's private observations dated across the last 3 years of his life, tracking Daniel's small, unremarkable choices with an attention that felt almost unbearable in its tenderness. March Daniel took a lower-paying contract so he could be home for Lily's school play. Sat in the back row, missed by everyone except me. Because I was there too, 3 rows behind him, and he never knew it. July. Offered a settlement by the Ashcrofts to sign away any claim to family involvement in exchange for a lump sum that would have solved every financial problem he has. He refused. Told the lawyer he'd rather struggle honestly than take money meant to buy his silence about Sarah. October Lily's birthday. He couldn't afford the party she wanted, so he built her a treehouse instead over 3 weekends, teaching her to use a hammer properly, laughing the whole time. I watched from the street. I have never been prouder of anyone in my life. Daniel sat with that last entry for a long time, throat tight, wondering how many afternoons his grandfather had spent parked at the curb outside his apartment, watching a life the rest of the family had written off as a cautionary tale and seeing instead something worth documenting, like scripture. He hadn't told Claire about the notebook. He wasn't sure why he trusted her enough to consider it, except that her honesty in the hallway had lodged itself somewhere he couldn't quite dislodge. And when she called 2 days later asking to meet, he found himself agreeing before he'd fully decided to. They met at a small coffee shop near his apartment, Neutral Ground, the kind of place where nobody from the Whitmore orbit would think to look for either of them. I wanted to apologize properly, Claire said, wrapping both hands around her cup like she needed something to hold on to. Not the hallway version, the real one. You already apologized. I said words. I'm not sure I meant all of them the way I should have. She looked down at the table. I grew up watching what this family does to people it decides don't belong. I was that person for a long time. The daughter of an in-law nobody quite wanted to claim. Always one mistake away from being reminded I was replaceable. And instead of learning from that, I spent years trying to become indispensable enough that they'd never make me feel that way again, which meant, more often than I'd like to admit, staying quiet when other people needed someone to speak up. Daniel turned his own cup slowly on the table. That's an honest answer. I'm trying honesty as a strategy these days. It's new for me. A small, tired smile. How's Lily? She's good. Better than the rest of us handle this family honestly. He hesitated, then decided for reasons he couldn't fully articulate to test the water. Can I ask you something off the record, lawyer to non-lawyer? Of course. What do you actually know about that separate document Grayson mentioned? The one nobody's supposed to talk about yet. Claire's expression shifted. Careful now, professional instincts visibly engaging. I know there's an internal financial review scheduled for next quarter. I know Marcus has been unusually resistant to it, arguing it should wait until after the succession is finalized. I know Grayson requested access to certain historical account records last week that he wouldn't normally need for a standard estate reading. She paused. And I know Arthur restructured his will exactly 8 months ago, right around the time an anonymous complaint was filed with the board about irregularities in the discretionary spending accounts. Daniel's pulse quickened. Irregularities meaning what? I don't know the specifics. That's genuinely true, not a lawyer dodge. She studied him. Why are you asking? You said you didn't know anything about the separate document. Daniel hesitated, weighing 6 years of careful silence against the strange, unfamiliar instinct that told him this woman, despite everything, might actually be trustworthy. I might have something my grandfather gave me before he died. I haven't finished reading it. Daniel, Claire's voice dropped urgent now. If that's connected to what Grayson is investigating, you need to be extremely careful. If Marcus finds out you have something before the review is public, and if it implicates him in anything— I overheard him on the phone, Daniel said quietly. The day of the will reading. He was telling someone to get into some accounts before the auditors could look. He said if I got anywhere near the company, a review would find something. He said whatever it takes to keep my name out of it. Claire went very still. You need to tell Grayson that. Today. I was planning to. No, I mean immediately. If Marcus is trying to obstruct an internal audit that's not just a family dispute anymore, that's potential fraud. And if he suspects you're a threat to whatever he's hiding— She stopped herself, visibly recalibrating. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of things. But please be careful, for Lily's sake if nothing else. Daniel nodded slowly, something cold settling in his chest at the reminder that whatever was unfolding here had stopped being abstract the moment Marcus's threats extended even implicitly toward the possibility of touching his daughter's stability. They parted with an uneasy truce between them, not quite trust, but something adjacent to it. A shared awareness that they were both standing near the edge of something the rest of the family hadn't yet noticed. That evening, Daniel finally finished the notebook. The final pages were different from the rest. Less observational, more direct. Written in a hand that looked shakier than the earlier entries, as though Arthur had composed them closer to the end, aware of his own diminishing time. Daniel, if you're reading this, it means the family has pushed hard enough, or Marcus has grown desperate enough, that Grayson decided you needed the full truth before the will's second provision is read. I am sorry I could not tell you this while I was alive. I was a coward about many things in my final years, and my relationship with you is chief among my regrets. You are the only person in this family who has never once asked me for anything. Not money, not position, not forgiveness for choices you never needed to apologize for. You built a life on your own terms after losing Sarah, and you did it with more integrity than every board member I have ever employed combined. I have named you my sole heir. Full controlling interest in Whitmore Industries effective upon verification of certain conditions, Grayson will explain. I did this not because you are owed it by blood, but because you are the only one who has proven through years of quiet, unwitnessed choices that you would actually protect what I built rather than plunder it. Marcus has been taking money from the company for 3 years. I have documentation. It is not enough on its own to prosecute. He has been careful, but combined with what the audit will find, it should be sufficient to remove him from any position of authority permanently. I am telling you this not so you can seek revenge. I am telling you because you will need to know when the moment comes that the fight in front of you is not about greed. It is about protecting the people who work for this company, the charities it funds, and the name your daughter will someday carry from a man who has already begun to hollow it out from the inside. Be careful. Be patient. And when the truth comes out, and it will come out because I have made certain of it, do not let them turn you into someone who needs to be cruel to be right. I love you. I loved watching the man you became, even from a distance. I am only sorry I did not tell you while I still could. Arthur Daniel sat at his kitchen table for a long time after finishing the letter. The notebook open in front of him, his vision blurred. One hand pressed against his mouth to keep from making a sound that might wake Lily. He thought of every dinner he'd sat through in silence, every insult he'd swallowed rather than defend himself against. Every moment he'd assumed his grandfather's distance meant disappointment, when in fact it had meant something closer to careful, patient witness. He thought too of Marcus's voice in the parking garage, whatever it takes, and understood, with a clarity that settled cold and certain in his chest, that whatever was coming would not be simple, and that the family had no idea yet how much was about to change. He called Grayson's office first thing the next morning, notebook in hand, and requested the earliest possible meeting. Chapter 4. The Name on the Will. Grayson scheduled the follow-up reading for the following week, at the same conference room, though this time the atmosphere in the room felt different, before anyone had even spoken. Marcus arrived, flanked by 2 board members and a lawyer of his own, his usual polish visibly strained at the edges. Patricia sat rigid, sunglasses absent, this time her attention darting nervously between Marcus and the door. Claire took her seat near the center of the table rather than the periphery. A small shift in positioning Daniel noticed and understood. He arrived with a notebook and a plain manila folder, dressed again in his one-good suit. Lily safely at school, unaware of what her father was about to walk into. "Let's begin," Grayson said once everyone had settled. "As I mentioned at our previous meeting, Arthur Whitmore's will contained a second provision, contingent on the verification of certain conditions. Those conditions have now been met." Marcus leaned forward. "What conditions exactly?" Arthur specified that the second provision could only be read once his designated heir came forward with a private document he'd entrusted to them, a verification mechanism, essentially to confirm his final wishes were carried out exactly as intended, without external interference. Grayson glanced toward Daniel. "Mr. Whitmore, if you would." Daniel's hands were steady as he set the folder on the table, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "My grandfather gave me this notebook 2 years ago. He told me not to open it unless I needed to. I opened it last week." He slid it across the table toward Grayson, who accepted it with a small, solemn nod, opening it to the pages he had apparently been told to expect. "This document," Grayson said, addressing the room, "along with independent verification I've conducted over the past week, confirms Arthur Whitmore's final and legally binding wishes." He looked up. "Arthur Whitmore has named Daniel Whitmore as sole heir to the entirety of his controlling interest in Whitmore Industries effective immediately. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds before it shattered into chaos. "That's absurd," Marcus said, his voice climbing control, fracturing visibly for the first time Daniel had ever witnessed. "He hasn't set foot in this company in 6 years. He works construction. He can barely afford his own apartment, and you expect this board to accept him as—" "The will is legally binding, Marcus," Grayson said calmly. "I'd advise you to consult your own counsel before making statements you might regret." "This is a mistake," Patricia's voice sharp with panic. "Arthur wasn't of sound mind. He was 83 years old. He'd had a stroke." "He drafted this 8 months before his stroke," Grayson said. "And I have 3 independent medical evaluations confirming his full cognitive competency at the time which I anticipated might be necessary given this exact reaction." Daniel sat very still through the eruption of protest, watching decades of assumed hierarchy crumble in real time, feeling something that wasn't quite triumph. Something closer to a strange, hollow vindication. The specific ache of finally being seen after years of being systematically unseen. Claire's eyes met his across the table, and in them he saw something he hadn't expected. Not surprise, but recognition, as though pieces she'd been quietly assembling for weeks had just clicked into their final position. Marcus stood abruptly, chair scraping hard against the floor. "This isn't over. There will be a challenge to this will. There will be a full review of Arthur's mental state in his final year of undue influence of... There will also," Grayson said, his voice dropping into something colder and harder than Daniel had heard from him before, "be a full financial audit of Whitmore Industries' discretionary accounts beginning next week, as authorized by the new controlling shareholder. I understand you're already aware of that particular development, Marcus, given the phone call you made in the parking garage of this building the morning of the first reading." The room went utterly silent. Marcus's face drained of color. "I don't know what you're implying," he said too quickly. "I'm not implying anything," Grayson said. "I'm informing you that Daniel Whitmore, as the new controlling interest holder, has already authorized an independent forensic audit of the accounts you've overseen for the past 3 years, and that Arthur left substantial documentation of his own concerns regarding certain discretionary transfers dating back considerably further than your interim tenure." Daniel watched his uncle's carefully constructed composure disintegrate in front of the entire room, watched decades of assumed superiority collapse into something closer to fear, and felt, despite everything, no particular satisfaction in it. Only a tired kind of clarity, the sense of a door finally opening onto a truth he'd spent 6 years locked out of. "You have no idea what you're doing," Marcus said, turning on Daniel directly, voice low and venomous now that the room's attention had shifted fully against him. "You think inheriting a title makes you capable of running a company? You've never sat in a boardroom in your life. You'll destroy everything Arthur built within a year, and everyone in this room knows it." "Maybe," Daniel said quietly. "Or maybe I'll run it the way he actually wanted it run, honestly and without stealing from the people who trust it." Something flickered across Marcus's face, not quite fear, not quite fury. Something colder and more calculating, and then, with the abruptness of a man switching tactics mid-sentence, his expression shifted into something almost pleasant. "Fine," he said. "You want the company? Take it. But you should know, Daniel, that running Whitmore Industries comes with scrutiny you've never experienced. Financial disclosures, background checks. Custody arrangements get reviewed differently when a 6-year-old is suddenly heir to a fortune this size. I'd think very carefully about whether you're prepared for what's about to be examined about your fitness as a father, given the circumstances of your wife's death." The room went cold. Daniel felt every muscle in his body lock into place. "What are you talking about?" His voice came out low, dangerous in a way it had never been before. "I'm simply saying," Marcus continued, smooth and merciless now, that a sudden dramatic change in a child's financial circumstances often triggers exactly this kind of review. Custody courts don't like surprises, Daniel. They like stability. And I have to wonder how stable a single father, working construction, living paycheck to paycheck 2 weeks ago, is going to look when a judge starts asking questions about his sudden acquisition of a multi-billion-dollar company. "Are you threatening my daughter?" "I'm simply pointing out realities," Marcus said, gathering his things with deliberate calm, the earlier panic replaced by something far more chilling. The composure of a man who had just found his next weapon. "I'll be filing a formal petition regarding Lily's living situation by end of week. Purely out of concern for the child's welfare, of course." He left the room with his lawyer trailing behind him, Patricia scurrying after them both, and the door clicked shut behind them with a finality that seemed to suck all the air out of the space. Daniel sat frozen in his chair, Grayson's careful legal victory suddenly feeling smaller and more fragile than it had 30 seconds before. Claire moved to the seat beside him. "Daniel, he's going after custody." His voice shook slightly. "He's going to use Lily against me." "He's going to try," Claire said, and something fierce entered her voice that hadn't been there before. "But that's a fight I can help you with. That's exactly the kind of case I know how to prepare for." "He said he'd file by end of week." "Then we have until end of week to make sure there's nothing to find." Claire's hand hovered near his arm, not quite touching, careful of the boundary. "You've raised that little girl alone for 2 years, Daniel. You have nothing to hide. We just need to make sure the court sees exactly what your grandfather saw." Grayson cleared his throat from across the table, his expression grave. "For what it's worth, Mr. Whitmore, I don't believe Marcus's petition will hold up under real scrutiny. But I won't pretend it isn't a serious threat, especially with the resources he still has access to during the audit transition. You should expect this to be difficult before it resolves." Daniel looked down at his hands, thinking of the notebook, of his grandfather's final written words. "Do not let them turn you into someone who needs to be cruel to be right," and felt the full weight of what he'd just inherited settle onto his shoulders, alongside a fear more immediate and more personal than any boardroom battle. He had won the company. He had exposed Marcus's desperation for exactly what it was. But as he walked out of that conference room into the gray afternoon light, phone already in hand to call Lily's school and confirm, with a fear he couldn't quite suppress, that she was safe. He understood that the truth had only just begun to cost him something, and that the hardest part of this fight was still ahead. Chapter 5. Everything He Never Said. 1. The Confrontation. Marcus filed his petition on Friday morning exactly as promised, and by Monday, Daniel found himself sitting across a conference table from his uncle for the second time in 2 weeks. This time not in Grayson's downtown office, but in the boardroom of Whitmore Industries itself, the space Daniel now technically controlled, though it still felt more like enemy territory than anything belonging to him. He'd requested the meeting himself, against Claire's cautious advice, because he'd decided somewhere over a sleepless weekend that he was done letting Marcus dictate the terms of every confrontation from a position of hidden information. Marcus arrived 10 minutes late, a small, deliberate power move Daniel recognized immediately, and took the seat directly across the table with the same easy confidence he'd worn at the memorial dinner 3 weeks earlier, as if nothing had fundamentally shifted between them. "I assume this is about the petition," Marcus said before Daniel had even finished sitting down. "It's about the money," Daniel said. "The forensic audit came back yesterday. Preliminary findings, anyway. Grayson has the full report." Something flickered behind Marcus's eyes, the first genuine crack in his composure since the will reading. "I'm sure whatever you think you found is easily explained." $2.3 million, Daniel said, moved through 4 shell accounts over the past 3 years. routed through a consulting firm that doesn't appear to actually exist. Grayson's forensic team traced the withdrawal patterns to timing that lines up almost exactly with quarterly payments to a private company in Macau. You want to explain that to me, or should we wait for the board to ask? Marcus's jaw worked silently for a moment. You don't understand the complexities of running a company this size. There are legitimate consulting arrangements that save it, Daniel said, and was surprised by how steady his own voice sounded. I'm not here to argue about spreadsheets. I'm here because you threatened my daughter's custody as leverage to protect yourself, and I want you to understand exactly how badly that's about to backfire. Is that a threat, Daniel? Marcus leaned forward, some of his old venom returning. Because I'd be careful. You're new to this world. You don't know how these things actually work. Boards protect their own. Judges favor stability. And a man who inherited a fortune 2 weeks ago, with no experience, no track record, and a dead wife whose death you've never fully explained to anyone in this family. Sarah died in a car accident, Daniel said. Low and dangerous now. On a night she was driving home from a dinner with this family, after Patricia told her she'd never be good enough to carry the Whitmore name. You want to talk about explanations, Marcus? Let's actually talk about that. Marcus went very still. I overheard you, Daniel continued, in the parking garage. Whatever it takes, you said. And I think you meant it, right up until the moment you realized the audit would find you before the custody petition ever reached a judge. So here's what's actually going to happen. You're going to withdraw the petition today in writing, or Grayson's forensic report goes to the district attorney's office along with a formal complaint from the board, which, and you should know this, voted unanimously yesterday afternoon to support full cooperation with any criminal investigation once they saw the numbers. You're bluffing. But Marcus's voice had lost its certainty. I'm really not. Daniel slid a folder across the table. Copies, not originals. Grayson had been careful about that. Read it yourself. Marcus opened the folder with hands that weren't quite steady, and Daniel watched for the second time in 2 weeks the particular collapse of a man who had built his entire identity on being untouchable, finally understanding that he wasn't. I built half of what this company became in the last decade, Marcus said finally, quietly, no longer performing for an audience. I gave 30 years to this family. And you stole $2.3 million from it while doing it, Daniel said without cruelty, only exhaustion. I'm not trying to destroy you, Marcus. I could have gone straight to the DA this morning. I didn't. I'm giving you a chance to resign, quietly repay what can be recovered, and walk away with whatever dignity is left. But the petition against my daughter gets withdrawn today. In writing, or none of that mercy applies. Marcus stared at him for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. Not quite remorse, but something adjacent to the recognition that the ground beneath him had shifted permanently. Fine, he said, finally the word costing him visibly. I'll withdraw it. Today, in writing. Today. Marcus stood gathering the folder with hands that trembled slightly now that the performance had ended. At the door he paused, not quite turning around. For what it's worth, I don't think you'll last a year in this seat. Maybe not, Daniel said, but I'll last it honestly. That's more than you managed. Marcus left without responding, and Daniel sat alone in the boardroom for several minutes afterward, hands flat on the table, feeling the strange, hollow aftermath of a fight he'd won, without any of the satisfaction he'd expected. 2. The setback. The written withdrawal arrived by courier that afternoon exactly as promised, and Daniel allowed himself for the first time in 3 weeks to believe the worst might actually be over. He was wrong. The custody hearing had already been scheduled before Marcus's withdrawal reached the court system, a bureaucratic delay Grayson explained apologetically over the phone that evening. The petition itself was gone, but the preliminary hearing triggered automatically the moment it was filed, still required a formal appearance to close the case properly. It should be routine, Grayson assured him, a formality. The judge will see the withdrawal and dismiss it within minutes. It was not routine. Daniel sat in family court 2 days later. Claire beside him at the petitioner's table. She'd insisted on representing him personally despite it falling well outside her usual practice area. A fact she'd waved off with a simple, "I know this family better than any custody attorney you'd hire off a referral list," and watched the judge, a stern woman in her 50s named Judge Alvarez, review the file with an expression Daniel couldn't quite read. "Mr. Whitmore," Judge Alvarez said, "I understand the original petitioner has withdrawn his complaint. However, in reviewing the initial filing, the court has independent concerns that warrant addressing before dismissal. Given the unusual financial circumstances described specifically a sudden and significant change in your household's assets, combined with your daughter's recent enrollment records showing 3 school transfers in 2 years." Daniel's stomach dropped. He hadn't anticipated the school transfers being raised. Each one had happened for mundane, unavoidable reasons. A move to a cheaper apartment after Sarah's death. Then another when his lease fell through. Then a transfer to be closer to affordable after-school care while he worked longer hours. "Your Honor," Clara said, rising smoothly, "those transfers reflect the ordinary difficulties of a single parent adjusting to sudden loss and financial strain, not instability in caregiving. My client has never missed a custody obligation, has maintained continuous employment throughout, and has a pediatrician, a school counselor, and a grief therapist all prepared to testify to the quality and consistency of his parenting. I'd like to hear from those sources before I'm prepared to dismiss the concerns raised," Judge Alvarez said. "I'm scheduling a follow-up hearing in 2 weeks, during which the court will request statements from the child's school and any relevant caregivers. Until then, I'm not inclined to fully close this matter." Daniel felt the floor tilt beneath him for the second time in as many weeks. 2 weeks. 2 weeks of uncertainty hanging over Lily's life, of wondering whether some judge who'd never met her might decide on the basis of paperwork and financial anomalies that she needed to be somewhere other than home with him. Outside the courthouse in the cold afternoon air, Daniel sat down heavily on a concrete bench, head in his hands. "I thought this was over," he said. "I thought once Marcus withdrew." "I know." Claire sat beside him, close enough that her shoulder nearly brushed his. "I'm sorry, Daniel. I should have anticipated the school transfer issue. That's on me." "It's not on you." He looked up at her, exhausted in a way that went deeper than sleep could fix. "None of this is on you. You've done more for me in the last 3 weeks than this entire family has done in 6 years." "That's a low bar," she said with the ghost of a smile. "But I'll take the compliment." He almost laughed despite everything. 2 more weeks. I don't know how I get through 2 more weeks, not knowing whether some judge is going to decide I'm not fit to raise my own daughter. "You get through it," Claire said, quieter now. "The same way you got through the last 2 years. 1 day at a time. And you're not doing it alone this time. I'll gather everything the court needs, the school records, the pediatrician's statements, whatever it takes to show them exactly who you are." She hesitated, then added softer, "I believe in you, Daniel. Not because of the company or the will or any of this. Because of the boy I remember watching learn to ride a bike alone in that driveway, while every other adult in his life was too busy performing at some gala to notice him fall and get back up and try again. That's who you've always been. This family just never bothered to see it." Daniel looked at her for a long moment, something shifting quietly in his chest. Not relief, not yet, but the first steady foothold he'd felt in weeks. "Thank you," he said, "for seeing it now at least." "Better late than never," she said, "though I intend to spend a long time making up for the years I didn't." 3. What he never said. 3 days later, on a Saturday afternoon bright with the last real warmth of autumn, Daniel stood at the edge of Lily's school playground, watching his daughter chase a soccer ball with a focus that made him ache with how uncomplicated her joy still was. how untouched by the chaos unfolding around her adult life. Claire found him there, having offered to bring over the pediatrician's statement for him to review before the follow-up hearing. Though Daniel suspected, watching her walk across the grass with 2 coffees in hand, that the paperwork was mostly an excuse. "She's fast," Claire said, handing him one of the cups, watching Lily execute a surprisingly competent dribble around an imaginary defender. "She gets that from Sarah." Daniel took the coffee, grateful for the warmth against the cooling afternoon. "Sarah played soccer in college, before everything." "Tell me about her," Claire said. "If you want to. I realize I know almost nothing about the woman this whole family spent years disparaging without ever actually knowing." Daniel was quiet for a moment, watching Lily fall, laugh, and scramble back up without breaking stride. She was stubborn, kinder than anyone had any right to be to a family that treated her like an inconvenience. She used to say the Whitmores were the loneliest rich people she'd ever met, because none of them knew how to actually enjoy anything they had. He smiled faintly. She would have loved watching Marcus fall apart in that boardroom, honestly. She never had much patience for cruelty dressed up as sophistication. She sounds like she saw people clearly. She did. Daniel looked over at Claire. She would have liked you, I think, once she got past the last name. Claire laughed softly. That's either a compliment or a very high bar. Both, probably. He hesitated, then found himself saying something he hadn't planned to say. "Can I ask you something? Why did you really keep showing up for this? The custody hearing isn't your job. None of this is actually your job." Claire was quiet for a moment, watching Lily kick the ball toward a cluster of classmates. "Because for 20 years I watched this family decide who deserved kindness and who didn't. And I was always terrified of ending up on the wrong side of that line. So I stayed quiet and useful and agreeable and told myself that was the same thing as being safe." She looked at him. "Watching you refuse to be who they decided you were. Watching you keep choosing honesty even when it cost you everything. It made me realize how much of my own life I'd spent choosing safety instead of what was actually right. I don't want to be that person anymore. I'd rather be the kind of person who shows up even when it's not required of me." "That's not nothing," Daniel said quietly. "No," she agreed, "it's not." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching Lily play, the late sun warm against the chill of the air, and Daniel found himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, simply present in a moment without bracing for the next blow. "I'm scared," he admitted finally. "About the hearing. About all of it. I got everything my grandfather wanted for me, and it feels like it's costing more than I have left to give." "You have more than you think," Claire said. "And you're not doing it alone. I know I'm relatively new to actually meaning that, but I do mean it." Lily chose that exact moment to come barreling over, breathless and grinning, soccer ball tucked under one arm. "Daddy, did you see my goal?" "I saw it, baby. It was incredible." Lily looked between her father and Claire with the frank curiosity of a 6-year-old cataloging new information. "Are you Daddy's friend?" Claire glanced at Daniel, something soft and uncertain in her expression, waiting, he realized, for him to define the moment. "Yeah," Daniel said after a beat. "She's my friend." "Good," Lily announced with the simple, unbothered authority of a child who'd decided the matter was settled. "You should come to my game next week. Daddy always comes, but nobody else ever does." "I'd like that," Claire said, and Daniel watched something in her face soften further. Watched the last careful distance she'd maintained since that first hallway apology finally begin to dissolve. Lily ran back off toward her friends, and Daniel found himself looking at Claire in the fading gold light, thinking of his grandfather's final written words. "Do not let them turn you into someone who needs to be cruel to be right." And understanding finally that the truest inheritance Arthur had left him wasn't the company at all. It was the permission to trust something good when it showed up, without waiting for the other shoe to drop. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I haven't wanted anyone at one of her games in 2 years. I didn't think I had room for anyone else. And now I think maybe I've had more room than I gave myself credit for." He held her gaze. "I'd like you there, not just for the hearing, for all of it, if you want that." Claire's smile, when it came, was unguarded in a way he hadn't seen from her before. None of the careful family diplomacy, none of the practiced neutrality. "I want that." The follow-up custody hearing 2 weeks later lasted exactly 11 minutes. The pediatrician's statement, the school counselor's testimony, and a stack of character references from job sites and neighbors painted a picture even Judge Alvarez couldn't dispute. And the petition was formally dismissed with a brief, almost apologetic acknowledgement that the court had needed to be thorough, given the unusual circumstances. Daniel walked out of the courthouse with Lily's hand in one of his and Claire's fingers laced loosely through the other into a bright, cold December afternoon, and for the first time since Sarah's death, he let himself believe that the life he'd built quietly, stubbornly, without anyone's approval, had finally been seen for exactly what it was. Whitmore Industries underwent a full leadership transition over the following months. Marcus resigned, quietly repaid what the audit determined recoverable, and disappeared from family gatherings entirely. His absence noted by exactly no one, with regret. Patricia, chastened by the shifting tide of family opinion, sent Daniel a stiff, unconvincing card of congratulations he never bothered to answer. Daniel restructured the company's charitable foundation in his grandfather's name, expanding scholarship funds for kids like the ones he'd grown up alongside on job sites. Kids the old Whitmore family would never have thought to notice. He kept the notebook in the cigar box, on a shelf now in an office that had once terrified him to imagine occupying, and read the final page again on quiet afternoons when the weight of the position threatened to feel too heavy. "I loved watching the man you became, even from a distance. I am only sorry I did not tell you while I still could." Daniel made sure from that point forward that he never let anyone he loved wonder the same thing about him.